Thank you everyone for joining my talk. My name is Zhila Aghajari and I'm a PhD student in Computer Science Department at Lehigh University. In this talk, I'll be discussing our paper, What's the Norm Around Here, when we examine the mechanism of norm perception around misinformation online. This work is motivated by the one that I and my co-author published in CSCW 2023. In that paper, we showed how lots of attention has been paid in addressing the individual impacts of misinformation. However, despite various ways by which misinformation impacts online communities, less is known about the community-level impacts of misinformation. So in this work, we are focusing on one of the broad impacts of misinformation at community level, that is shaping perception around norms of a community. Lots of prior studies have been shown us how norm perception can influence people's behavior and their response to the behavior of others, specifically in the context of misinformation. However, despite the impact they have, less is known about how they are perceived online. So in this work, we are asking how a community's norms around misinformation are perceived, what are the elements that are involved. We also take a step further and examine how norm perception can then lead broader impression about a community in terms of what the community as a whole tolerates, what types of behavior they are likely to engage in. Now, when referring to social norm, it's very important to distinguish between two types of norms. We have collective norms that refer to the actual norms of a community, but we also have perceived norms that are related to individual perception around those community norms. But these two can be really deviated from each other. For example, consider the case of drinking. In a lot of prior studies, it's been shown that people often form exaggerated perception around how much others around them drink. And given that they are influenced by perceived norms, in our study, we also focus on perception of norms. And there are three types of perceived norms. We have descriptive norms that refer to perception around how common a behavior is. We also have injunctive norms that refer to perception around how we think a behavior might be endorsed by people of a community. We also have subjective norms that refer to our perception around how we think we are expected to behave in a community. Now, there are some insights from prior work in other contexts around mechanisms that might be involved in norm perception. For instance, prevalence of behavior has been shown to influence individuals' behavior both in online and offline setting. For example, in a recent work, Masoul et al. Shows that when people see a lot of others show their personal pictures online, they are more likely to do so as well. And the authors argue that this influence occurs via norm mechanism. So in our study, we are examining whether that's the case in the context of misinformation or not. Another element that influenced individuals' behavior and their response to various issues is how others respond to the same issue. For example, in a recent work, Colinder shows that many people's perception of news credibility is impacted by how others respond to the news. And the author attributes this influence to the role of social norms. But given that perception of those norms were not measured, we don't know if that's the case. So in our study, we are going to examine that. A third source of information that informs people about a community's norms could be related to communities' established rules. For example, in a recent work, Matisse shows that providing normative information in the form of community rules can decrease harassing conversations online. And the author suggests that this effect occurs by influencing perception of norms of a community. But again, since the perceived norms are not measured in that study, we don't know if that's the case. So we are going to examine that in our experiments. Now, perceived norms are important not only per se, but through the impacts they have. One such impact can be contributing to impression about social tolerance of various behavior. And these impressions can be really important as they can impact people's behavior as well as their response to the behavior of others. So in our study, we are asking how norm perception might lead to impression about social tolerance. Also motivated by how prior work shows us people who believe in one conspiracy theory are more likely to believe in other forms of conspiracy theory. We are examining whether that's the case related to perception or not. Specifically, we are asking, do norm perception around one conspiracy theory guide expectation around belief in other forms of conspiracy theory or not? Also, another impact of norm perception might be forming expectation around how behaviors might escalate in a community. And that's motivated by prior work that suggests people often form exaggerated perception around norms around conspiracy theory and overestimate the extent to which people around them believe in such theories. So we are asking, do such exaggerated perception can then lead to expectation around how behaviors might escalate in this context? So to incorporate for this broader impression, we expanded our model to examine these potential links. Now, to examine these questions and hypothesize, we designed two complementary studies. The first one is conducted using a screenshot approach to get some initial results. And the second one is a simulation-based approach. And for that, we use a platform called Truman. Truman is very similar to Facebook, except that it's created for conducting controlled experiment, and researchers have all the control over the content and the interaction that occurs in this simulation. We ask our participants to join this platform, create an account, and interact with other users. This setting allows us to measure norm perception based on a more realistic setting and based on the interaction for a longer period of time. For the interest of time, I'm going to focus on study 2. So for that, we designed a 3x2x2 between subject study. We manipulated prevalence of behavior via controlling for the ratio of misinformation posts. And for that, we focused on anti-vaccine content. We also controlled for community responses to be either pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine comments. The community rules were either present or absent depending on the experimental condition. And for that, we used a sticky note showing that on the top of the feed that participants saw. So when we conducted our experiment and tested out our model, we learned that how prevalence of behaviors as well as other responses to such behaviors, that is posting anti-vaccine content, contributed to norm perception. But we did not observe the effect of community rules on norm perception. We also observed the effect of this element on broader impression about the community. Also, norm perception guided broader impression about the community in terms of what the community as a whole might tolerate, what types of behavior they are likely to exhibit, and whether or not they are likely to believe in other forms of conspiracy theory. Now, these findings have very important implications, both for designing platforms for online communities, as well as for designing policies for those online communities. We learned the impacts of community responses on norm perception. So it's important to foreground them when they are trying to dispute pieces of false content in order to address the broader impacts of such content on norm perception. We also learned that while community rules are important, they are probably not sufficient in addressing the broader impacts of misinformation at community level. Now, this work helped us understand what we noticed less explored in prior work. It helped us understand the impact of misinformation at community level. Now, this knowledge is important not only by itself, but by suggesting a very important and underexplored trajectory for future work to examine. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I'm happy to answer any question on our paper.